So we were talking about Egypt and I got to the religion part. We're in World History, chapter 5. And the religion of Egypt was very humanistic, naturalistic, and polytheistic. So what does that mean? Well, humanists, they worship man. And indeed they did worship the pharaohs. Naturalists deified or worshipped the forces of nature. And they worshipped the Nile and they worshipped a lot of nature too. And they were polytheists, which mean basically they worshiped thousands of gods and goddesses. And you can see that. And man could even manipulate the gods for his own benefit in some way if he tried. And the Egyptian plagues in the book of Exodus, we have them written for us there as those plagues struck the pagan worship of man and nature and showed the futility. Basically, each one of those plagues was towards an Egyptian god or goddess. And of course, man spent his time preparing for his tomb in his afterlife, but in the worship of these strange gods. And indeed, they were very strange. If you look at this picture here, you see most of them were half human with animal heads. And that's what they worshipped. You can see these are in the museum in the Egyptian part. You can see but indeed, very, very strange gods. You'd think they would, and surely because we know at that time, the Hebrew God was God of the true and living God that loved them. And so a lot of Egyptians had heard of the true and living God, but they worshiped all these other deities. Pyramids. So the pyramids, we know the pyramids were made as tombs and places to worship actually. And the Great Pyramids, they were almost similar to the ziggurats, but they were basically just a little, didn't have all of the terraces like they have on some of the ziggurats. But anyway, the Great Pyramids of Cheops at Giza are still there. And Giza called Khufu or Khufu back then, but now if you go to Giza in Egypt and you'd see these pyramids, and there's 3 of them. Well, 3 large ones, I should say. And well, it took 100,000 workers for 20 years to do the Pyramid of Cheops. And it covers 13 acres. 2,300,000 blocks were used, and each one of those blocks weighed 2.5 tons. Can you imagine that? The pyramid was 480 feet high with 3,360,000 cubic yards capacity. They're huge. And these pyramids were, this whole valley where the pyramids were called the Valley of the Kings. And one time in the Valley of the Kings, they found another tomb of another pharaoh king, and it was Tutankhamun. And Tutankhamun was a teenage pharaoh, and he was only 18. And they found this in 1922, and they had exquisite treasures and everything in King Tut's tomb. And even though at that time Egypt wasn't flourishing that much, we know basically the riches they had because of what was in this young pharaoh's tomb. And they preserved their bodies by mummification. And so even now you could see the bones and everything because of how they mummified them, you could see them intact. So this is the Cheops. This is the pyramids at Giza. I'm going to talk about a little bit more in a little bit. And here's here's King Tut, and this is the Sphinx. And the Sphinx actually is at the same place here, and it was for one of the pharaohs of these 3 pharaohs. The Sphinx is like lion feet with a head of a man that looked like one of the pharaoh's heads. I mean, that they modeled it after. Hieroglyphics and Rosetta Stone. So the hieroglyphics, well, what happened? Back in time, they found these hieroglyphics. They were there, but they didn't know how to interpret them or knew what they said. And so they had to find some way. Well, the hieroglyphics had 24 alphabetic symbols in what these hieroglyphics now, in what the alphabet that they made them into as they put them together. Remember, they had 700 of the pictographs, and they turned in, as they turned into the phonographs, they turned into this alphabet. And so they had these consonants, they called them consonants, and they had 24, and the vowels weren't written out, just the consonants. And then they had numerous pictograms and ideograms and phonograms with them. But in this here, you can see there's three different types. And one was hieratic, and it was like a simplified cursive and a form of dictation. And the other was demotic or demotic. That was like the short, well, I was gonna say demotic, that would be kind of weird. But demotic was the shorthand that they used. But they on this Rosetta Stone, the key was they had it in not only Egyptian, which that nobody knew how to read, but they also had it in Greek. And that was the key. It was written in Greek. So then they had the key of the Rosetta Stone. They had this key because they knew Greek. Everybody knew Greek. And so they ended up to be able to interpret it because of the Greek interpretation. And that's why they called it the Rosetta Stone, the way they could interpret Egyptian hieroglyphics. And now it's kind of known that they use that for any, actually any type of language translation. They call in this called the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone, when did they find it? Well, they found it in 1798, was discovered, and Napoleon went in. You can see Napoleon went in to conquer Egypt at that time in 1798, and he discovered this broken slab of black basalt near the town of Rosetta. And so he called it a Rosetta Stone because it was next to that town. And it contained those messages of those three languages that I told you, and the hieroglyphics and the Demotic Greek were on it. And then also because of Greek, they could translate it. Jean-François Champollion, he's the one that was able to decipher the Egyptian grammar in a dictionary to translate these ancient texts. So here we have basically we're ending here with our chapter 5, and chapter 6 is going to go on with Egypt 2, or actually chapter 5.2 is going to go on to, let's go ahead and get started on that a little bit here. Let's see. Slideshow. Okay, here we go. This is section 5.2 of Egypt, and I'm going to kind of just go right straight through it because it's kind of short. And it goes into the kingdoms, which we have the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom, and the foreign domination. And this is through the ages. So it's not at one time. At one time, the Old Kingdom was in charge, and then the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom through time. So we see here, this is actually the delta of the Nile. And this is Giza and all this whole area. And this is where this all happened. And here's actually, I kept trying to think of which one. I think this is Ramses, a picture of Ramses. And here's some of the way that the Egyptians dressed back in ancient history there. Ancient history, the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom was divided into 30 dynasties until Menes, the first pharaoh, united the Upper and Lower Egypt. And so we kind of went over that in the last section there. Here's a picture of it. There were 3 monarchs that were really big during the Old Kingdom, and they have 3 pyramids, right? So we have Khufu, and that's Cheops. His name was Cheops, and that's the big one that we talked about before. And then Khafre was the other one, and then Menkaure. So there were three of the largest pyramids by Cairo. Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. And here we have their tombs and their pyramids. The Great Sphinx here, he was the head of a man body and the lion and resembled Khafre. So they think that basically that was given to and all these guys are related. I think the son and the grandson, but they're all related in some way. The Old Kingdom collapsed, struggling. There was all these kings, or I should say pharaohs, they're struggling at that time, and there were rival kings in the area that ruled at Memphis and Heraclius, Cleopolis. I can't even say that. But anyway, it looks like this. So, and Thebes. And so anyway, so they were very much rivals. And then came the Middle Kingdom. This is later on in time. And the Middle Kingdom during that stage of time was King Mentuhotep. Mentuhotep. Can you say that? Mentuhotep. Anyway, it was the 11th dynasty, and he reunited those two kingdoms again, and it was a powerful 12th dynasty after it. And the capital was at Thebes, and expanded and influenced Asia, and they had huge irrigation projects during this time in the Middle Kingdom. And also close during this time, this would be the time of Abram, before he was named Abraham, that he entered Egypt in search of food. It'd also be the latter part of this time would be where Joseph in the Bible, where you saw Joseph was the prime minister in Egypt and settled in Goshen and brought his family into Goshen. And you can read that in Genesis 2. So this is that time period, that middle time period. Hyksos were the shepherd kings or Amalekites. And Hyksos, when you think of Hyksos, the Egyptians did not want the Hyksos there. They were the foreigners are considered. In fact, they considered Hebrews as being shepherd kings, because remember, Egyptians, they raised cattle, and Hebrews raised sheep, and Egyptians did not like sheep at all. So anytime Hyksos would come in with the shepherd kings or Amalekites, or Hebrews would come in, they would want to chase them out or get rid of them, get rid of their sheep. They did not like the sheep. And also some of the Hyksos, the Amalekites, it said, possessed chariots and horses. So basically, anyway, let's go on. The new kingdom, the new king who did not know Joseph in Exodus 1:8. So Ahmose the first was the Theban prince, and he founded the new kingdom. And the new kingdom drove the Hyksos out, which, of course, the Hebrews were one of the Hyksos they drove out, the shepherd kings, and they wanted to erase the remembrance of them. So that would be pretty terrible. But when you look at it, really, did they drive them out? Because when you look at the Hebrews especially, they wanted them as slaves, of course. And so the theory is they drove them out, but really they wanted to keep them there. And God delivered them by Moses. So some of the Hyksos were drawn out, or drove out, but others remained. But we know the story of what happened after Exodus. Looks like Egypt started to go downhill after Exodus. So there was oppression and persecution of the Hebrews and Semites like the Hyksos. So during the time of the New Kingdom. Hatshepsut. So Hatshepsut was, they think possibly that would have been Moses' foster mother that pulled Moses out of the river. And we have the picture of Moses there as a baby in a basket and her pulling the baby out. And here we have Miriam looking at her. What a beautiful picture there. So Amenhotep the first, or Thutmose the first, was probably when Moses was born. And we know that she was Hatshepsut was a strong-willed daughter, so she would get whatever she wanted. So it was probably was that. And also later on, the female pharaoh ruled jointly with his nephew Thutmose III. So we have a woman actually ruling during this time too. The Egyptian Empire. Okay, we had the new kingdom of the dynasties, and those dynasties, basically we have the 18th dynasty through the 20th dynasty. And Egypt went to the farthest borders and the greatest height under Thutmose III. And then Amenhotep and his son possibly were during the Exodus. I already kind of went over there. And then after that, there was the period of decline. So we have a picture here of basically the Hebrews leaving Egypt. Later New Kingdom was Ramses II, and he fought the Hittites, and he had some building projects at that time. He was the 20th dynasty, and he did the invasions of Libyans, and the Sea Peoples were Philistines actually. And so he invaded those areas and took over those areas. But Egypt had a long eclipse. That means getting long eclipse is getting smaller and smaller, isn't it? And Egypt never had dominance again after that point. Foreign domination came in. Foreign countries came in, like the Libyans and Sudanese came in Egypt. The Assyrians ousted the Sudanese out then, and the Syrians took over. And then they had this period that they call the Sete period. And this period actually was where Egypt entered in a brief renaissance, or a brief period where Egypt became strong again, but it was very short-lived. And then Persia took over. We know that even from the Bible, where Persia took over, and then Alexander the Great took over in 332 BC. And we talk about Alexandria. When Alexander the Great came in, he founded this great city. And in Alexandria, there was first of all, it was a great library. Even, it was built not just for under Alexander the Great, but even after that point. But they put this library together. It had 70,000 ancient scrolls. But when Julius Caesar came in, he put siege to Alexandria to conquer Alexandria in 47 BC, and that library was set on fire. So Rome is considered, burning down the ancient scrolls was a big black spot for the history of Rome when Julius Caesar went in and burnt down that library. So, and this is where the Old Testament was translated into Greek. It's called the Septuagint. And so they translated in Egypt, just like we know there was a lot of Hebrews even later on that had gone to live in Alexandria that were from Egypt. Alexandria also had the lighthouse, and it was one of the wonders of the ancient world, the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And it was 440 feet high marble. And it could cast light on 35 miles across the sea. It stood 1,000 years, then finally it was destroyed by an earthquake. So you can imagine. Now this picture here shows how that it would look, but this is how it really probably looked. This old picture of the lighthouse of Alexandria and how it had fire on the top there and everything. So, and here's these tiny, tiny ships. So remember the library and the lighthouse when you think about Alexandria, that city in Egypt. After Alexander's death, Ptolemy, so we have Ptolemy was one of his generals, and he took control of Egypt. And so the Hellenistic Greek dynasty ruled under Cleopatra until her suicide. And she committed suicide, and basically as Rome was going to come in, and she felt that she was going to be killed. And you can look that, it was 30 BC. So she was afraid that she would be tortured. But anyway, she was one of the leaders, and these were the leaders of Alexander's general, Ptolemy. So they were very Greek, more than they were Egyptian. Egypt was part of the Roman Empire then, and later it was part of the Arab world. And the Islamic religion and the Arab language came in as those Muslims came in and started taking over Egypt. And Egypt even now being Islamic, mainly Islamic, more than anything else. Although there's a lot of Christians there still too. And the new capital now wasn't Alexandria anymore, it was Cairo. Cairo was the great city of the Arab world. So now when you think of Egypt, you think of an Arab type language, or in an Arab type environment, and Islamic religion, which is Muslim. Here's a picture of Alexander the Great as he was coming into Alexandria. Here's a picture of Cleopatra, and she was in love with Mark Antony, which is one of Julius Caesar's generals. But he ended up actually dying, probably committed suicide. So it's a terrible story. And they do a lot of movies about it. So that's it.